Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I had a stalker once in an apartment which had 4 exits, one of which I had no access to. Old building, crappy maintenance, landlord who wasn't up to code and wasn't around, etc. Some creep used to stand outside one of my doors late at night and run off when I go to the door. Did I mention the shitty building with paper-thin walls? The landlord didn't care, and I assumed it was a drug addict or something. Eventually, I woke up at night, thought a rodent was at one of the exit doors to the downstairs area, but as I got closer, I realized someone was unscrewing the screws to the doorknob. I watched 2 screws drop to the floor, the entire doorknob fall off. It was shoddy as shit, and instinctively, I chose fight instead of flight, so I slammed my hand against the door as hard as I could while bending over and stared into the hole where the doorknob was, where another eye met mine. Called the police. They didn't find anyone as usual, and couldn't really do anything. Time goes by and I am scared shitless. Time went by and I couldn't shake the feeling that this person was more than just an attempted burglar. I eventually decided to really grill the maintenance guy because he was the only one with keys to my apartment, even though he brushed me off before. He was a mentally ill guy who always weirded me out and said inappropriate stuff, so I asked him a ton of questions and finally got around to really pressing him and demanding he tell me if he's ever seen anyone trying to get into my apartment. That's when he said, "What, your girlfriend?" I freaked out. I have no girlfriend. I had a flood of thoughts and suspicions, starting with suspecting this guy. I initially had a rush of thoughts like if this guy was the person doing this, or what the fuck he was talking about. Convo passed and I almost hysterically questioned him, and he got around to realizing I had no idea what he was talking about. That's when he said he thought the crazy woman in one of the apartments was my girlfriend, and he had been letting her into my apartment for a long time when I was away. My body went cold. Every time I found hair that I didn't think could have been me or anyone I had over in my bathroom, every time I thought food was missing, every time I thought things were moved a little. I ignored it all, but it was her. This batshit crazy woman who I thought was a shut-in was telling people in the complex that I was her boyfriend about fights we supposedly had, and all sorts of shit. The stuff I was hearing outside my doors at night was her, and she was inside my apartment whenever I'd leave. I called the police and left. I had to deal with a scumbag landlord, mentally ill maintenance guy, and the cops with no results except for getting out of my lease. She stalked me for a year. She had details of an ongoing relationship for an entire year, she told other tenants. She shared all my private spaces by lying to the half-brain-dead maintenance guy. And that night she was removing the doorknob. I think she was going to hurt me. I'm not going to CSI answer questions on this. This was real, it's not paranormal. It gets worse than I've typed, but I don't want to go through all the shit before I realized I had a stalker. And now that I've posted this, I'm done because this shit horrifies me to this day, and this is my limit for thinking about it.
That is some spooky shit, bro.
Yeah, the worst stuff is real. Ghosts are spooky because they're unknown, but when you actually think about or go through the shit that can happen with people and whatever, you realize that the paranormal isn't the creepiest stuff out there. People can get completely screwed in the head, and what they do just doesn't make sense, but they do it, and they can spend insane amounts of time doing it. Humans can become monsters, and they can hide in plain sight. The person-turned-monster I experienced did a lot of shit, all of which I dismissed as something else, because I was just so intent on living my life and being logical about stuff. I never even believed someone would do that, so I always assumed it was mice. And even when I was certain someone was standing outside my doors late at night, I told myself it was just a junkie or whatever. It was every day for a year. The mice weren't mice, there never was any junkie. My stuff was moved any time I went away, usually twice a month. The bangs I felt under my floorboards. It was her in the bottom floor, an inaccessible area, except for from her apartment, slamming up to mine. The loud bangs waking me up weren't neighbors being generally loud at night. It was her trying to wake me up. Man, I moved out of there but almost had a total breakdown after realizing how much stuff happened. I lost like 20 pounds and felt sick to my stomach for an entire month. For an entire year, this monster was obsessed and involved with my life. I dealt with it as best I could, but a police sergeant who sympathized said that they needed more to do anything. I was less concerned with getting justice and more concerned with getting free and safe, so I got what I could get done. Getting out of lease obligations, getting last month and security rent back, no extra fees or bills from the scumbag landlord, and left. For all I know, she still lives there and might be stalking a new tenant.
Back in 2009, I had moved in with my dad due to some complications that my mom and I were going through. I was 15 at the time. My father's place was a small apartment, located on the property of his landlord's house. Things went well there for a few months, but then something unfortunate happened. On a Friday morning, my father walked to the landlord's house to pay him for the month. They would usually meet on his front porch and have coffee together while discussing current events or political subjects. However, this time, he wasn't there. My father knocked on the door and rang the doorbell several times. However, there was no answer. We began to worry because his car was still there. We waited for about a half an hour, and then we made the decision to call the police. They arrived at the property in just a few minutes and were able to break inside of his house after attempting to get him to answer again. The police searched all areas, closets, and every single crevice of the house. The landlord was nowhere to be found. A few days later, the landlord's son informed us that he would be staying at his father's house to watch over the few apartments that were located on his property and to attend to the other needs of his father, such as his pets. My father gave the son the payment to hold on to for that time until the landlord may be found. A few nights later, I couldn't fall asleep because I was disturbed by some noise that was coming from the upper floor apartment. I finally got out of bed to ask my father about it, because I didn't recall anyone occupying that apartment before then. He told me that the landlord's son had a friend of his staying up there for the week because he was having financial difficulty. I eventually went back to bed. However, I was still being annoyed by the sounds that were coming from upstairs. I finally decided to go up there to politely inform them that they were being too noisy. As I walked up the staircase, the noises began to slowly fade away and stop. I approached the door and began to knock. I must have knocked around 10 times before I was finally answered by a tall, bearded, older man who appeared to be in his 70s or 80s. He asked me why I was disturbing him at this time of the night, and I informed him of the noise coming from his apartment. He then apologized to me, told me that his TV was broken, and said that he was attempting to fix it. He then asked me if I could step inside to assist him. I had a bad feeling in my stomach when he said that. It was a sharp pain that refused to go away. I then began to stare into the dark living room behind the front door where the old man was standing. As my eyes began to adjust to the darkness, I began to see a figure standing in front of one of the bedroom doors behind him. I couldn't see a lot of detail. I could only tell that they had an object in their hand. I immediately told the old man that I felt sick and ran down the staircase. The next morning, I was extremely tired after being deprived of sleep during the night. I was only able to get around an hour of rest. I decided to stay awake for the following day and wait until the night to try and sleep again. My mind was wandering around the thoughts of the previous night. Something did not seem right about the situation upstairs. I decided to take a walk outside to get my mind off of the events of the previous night, and as an attempt to get rid of the general sleepy feeling I was experiencing. I walked outside to find my father, the other apartment tenants, and tons of law enforcement officers outside, standing in front of the landlord's house. Law enforcement was called because one of the tenants had gone to the landlord's house, went inside, and was later found dead on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood. As the officers searched further, they found the landlord laying dead on the ground, with his right hand chopped off and missing. They found it laying in front of a safe in the landlord's bedroom. The safe had a bloody handprint on the door, which had been opened by the landlord with a key that was still inside of the keyhole. There was no contents to be found in the safe at the crime scene, only the two bodies of the landlord and the tenant who went to his house. The son and the old man upstairs were both missing in action. I went to inform the police about the son and the man I talked to upstairs the previous night, along with the figure I saw standing behind him. I was then told that the landlord never had children, and all of his family lived very far away from our area.
I never met the occupant of the apartment below mine. When I moved in, I went around and introduced myself to the tenants, who were mostly friendly, except an old alcoholic veteran who had lost his arm in Nam and hadn't forgiven the world for it. He just slammed the door in my face. But when I knocked on the door to the apartment below mine, I got barely an answer at all. Just a small note slipped under the door, scribbled in red ink on old yellowed notebook paper, asking who I was and what I wanted. I jotted down a simple greeting. "Hi, this is Jason. I just moved into the apartment over yours and wanted to introduce myself." I slipped the note back under the door and almost immediately received another, this one on the back of a napkin with a brown stain on it. Coffee, maybe? All it said was, "Leave." I didn't think much of it at the time, instead assuming the resident was mute or paranoid, or an old alcoholic veteran who had lost his tongue in Nam and hadn't forgiven the world for it, or some combination of the three. Either way, I paid less and less attention to the apartment below mine as the days went by. For months, the only reminder I had that anyone lived there at all was the faint sound of hardcore porn, all grunts and screams, leaking through the floorboards of my bedroom late at night. I awoke on an early April morning to the shrill drone of an electric drill burrowing into the wall. The sound was clearly coming from the apartment below mine. A quick glance at the clock told me that nobody, not even a paranoid, mute, tongueless vet, ought to be awake at this hour. Cursing, I threw on my pants and stumbled out of my apartment and down the stairs to confront the guy. By the time I reached the door, the sound was so loud that I was astonished there wasn't a crowd outside his door trying to bust it down and lynch him. The drilling continued through my first few knocks, but after I kicked the door and shouted for him to come out, the sound stopped. I heard shuffling inside, then some soft footsteps, and a note slid out from underneath the door. This note was identical to the last, except that "leave" was now capitalized, and the stain was cherry red instead of brown. Furious, I slammed my fist on the door, then stomped back upstairs to give my landlord a call. He told me not to worry about the guy downstairs, that the guy used to be an engineer for a train company and was probably just working on some personal project, but he would definitely let him know that the noise level was unacceptable at that time of day. Still irritated, but relieved that the noise had stopped since my visit, I got back into bed and immediately fell back asleep. The drilling continued throughout the next few weeks, though thankfully he'd gotten the message and only did it during the day. The other tenants and I discussed it frequently. Everyone had their own guess as to what he was doing in there. Some of them agreed with the landlord. Just a personal project to waste time. He never left the apartment, after all. Others had more grandiose ideas. The lady across from me was certain he was building a time machine, while my neighbor down the hall swore he peeked through the crack of the door one time and saw a laboratory worthy of a mad scientist, full of test tubes containing rainbows of chemicals, jars of pickled limbs, and plenty of beakers, burners, and benches. I didn't know what to think. Eventually, the drilling was replaced by hammering, the hammering by sanding, and the sanding by silence, save for the faint sound of hardcore videos, all grunts and screams, leaking through the floorboards of my bedroom late at night. Only this time, there was a slow creaking and rocking to accompany it. There was still a year left on my lease when I came back from vacation to find the entire complex filled with a thick charcoal odor, sweetened the slightest bit by sulfur. Everyone I asked told me it had been that way for a couple days now, that the landlord was investigating and working on getting the smell removed, and that for the meantime we just had to deal with it, unfortunately. The only person seemingly unbothered by the smell was the guy in the apartment below me. The landlord hadn't received any complaints from him, and his routine hadn't changed a bit. Still, my dreams were filled with faint grunts and screams, and even muffled sobs sometimes. I didn't know what the guy's deal was, but I was getting sick of it. Then in December, during a massive snowstorm, I was hanging out watching Christmas movies with a few of the people on my floor. Everyone was having a good time. There was food aplenty and ale flowed freely. When Santa's sled landed atop a house in the movie we were watching, a solid thud, much too loud for the movie, filled the room. Everyone stopped and looked at each other quizzically. I paused the movie, but we didn't hear anything else for several minutes, so play resumed and everyone went back to getting fat and drunk. Frosty. The snowman had just begun when a terrible raging roar erupted from downstairs. Everyone paused in confusion and fear. Within seconds, my apartment was filled with smashing and thumping and knocking and screaming, all from the apartment below. Assuming the guy was having a mental breakdown, I called 911 and they assured me they'd send over some officers and an ambulance just in case. The police were on their way shortly, their sirens screeching through the night. As soon as they could be heard, all the ruckus from below stopped, but only for a moment, and was replaced by frantic searching and rummaging and racing back and forth. Finally, the back window smashed, and it was quiet again. We half-heartedly resumed the movie, filled with a lot less joy than Frosty should have made us. One by one, my guests made excuses to leave, and eventually I was all alone with Frosty and his friends. Disheartened by the abandonment and confused by the still screeching sirens, I decided to take a walk. On my way out, I walked down the hall below mine. The apartment below mine's door was wide open, so I took a peek inside. I wish I hadn't. Along the back wall was a sturdy rectangular frame of steel bars, maybe 5 feet tall. From each of the corners sprouted a hook, attached to which was several feet of heavy chains. At the end of the chains were shackles, just a few inches in diameter. The chains were laying on an ancient yellowed mattress, covered in stains of all colors. Some of them were recognizable: blood, ink, lipstick. I didn't want to think what the others might be. Rows and rows of lubricants, oils, creams, and other substances I didn't want to recognize dominated a shelf to the side. On another was gags, belts, whips, leather strips, and other sorts of restraints, along with an electric cattle brand. But none of those were quite so disturbing as the pile of schoolgirl uniforms in the corner. I defaulted on my lease and left the next day.
I'm gonna bump this with a personal story for all of you. I had just graduated and, like most college students, had no money or job. Me and a few of my friends decided to go in on a shitty apartment together just until we get on our feet. Find this great 3-bedroom for cheap, but the landlord was extremely suspicious. No contract was ever signed, just required money up front every month. The apartment itself was nice, but very old, like something out of the 1920s. Except for this one massive part of the hallway closet that looked like it was recently plastered over. Just an awkward white spot that nobody tried to hide or paint over. We asked the landlord about it, and he just said it was from recent renovations. We knew this was complete bullshit, but we were desperate and the place was cheap. Cut to a month later, we're all settled in and doing fine. One night we're watching TV when there's a knock at the door. 2 massive fucking Russians are standing at our doorstep. I mean, like 6-foot-tall, prison muscle-jacked guys. One was wearing a sailor hat and tank top, which looked tremendously funny, but at this point none of us were laughing. They asked about some guys, saying they owed them money. We tell them that we have been living there for a month, and that we don't know the men they are looking for. The Russians get visibly confused, but don't push the issue much further. Instead, they get in their car and just sit there watching our apartment for several hours. Now, this apartment was in a super shitty neighborhood. We're talking boarded up houses, drug dens, drive-by shooting kind of shitty, so nobody cared or took notice of some suspicious guys sitting in their cars for hours like us. Eventually, we all got freaked out enough to call the cops. Of course, once the single cop showed up, the Russians flew off. We explained to him what happened, but he said there wasn't much he could do other than tell officers to keep a lookout for the car. The whole time we were talking, he kept looking around the apartment nervously, and finally, right before he left, he asked us, "Do you guys live here by choice?" We were a little freaked by the question, but told him we were just college kids looking for someplace cheap. He asked if we knew the story behind this place, and when we answered no, he told us what he knew. Apparently, a bunch of illegal immigrants had been living in this apartment previously, but had all been deported. Somehow, they had gotten wondering that the immigration police were coming mere minutes before they came. One of them had somehow managed to get into the spaces behind the walls and hide there for several hours as the police searched the place. The police made the hole in the closet trying to get to him, but he had escaped and was still at large. Of course, after telling us that horrific story, the cop left and we pretty much stayed up all night afraid a bunch of Russians were going to murder us. Next month, we confronted our landlord, saying we knew about the illegals and he begged us not to move out. We were probably the first tenants in years that had paid rent on time and in full each month. Anyways, none of us had any better options at the time, so we were kind of stuck anyway. So we stayed. The next post is when things started getting batshit crazy. Another couple of weeks passed and neither of us had seen the Russians again, so we were starting to feel more relaxed again. Except for one of my roommate's girlfriends. She didn't live there, but stayed with us several times a week. One morning she asked if we had heard shuffling and scratching at night. We were all heavy sleepers, so we just wrote it off as typical odd noises in an old place. Only a few nights later, I had fallen asleep on the couch watching TV. When I finally awoke to head to my own bed, I also heard the scratching. It sounded like rats burrowing in our walls and ceilings. There would be several seconds of furious scratching, and then what sounded like pieces of wood or debris falling or settling. The next day, I told my roommates, and that night we all stayed up together and heard the scratching skittering once again. We all concluded it was rats and called the landlord to hire an exterminator. The asshole took several weeks to follow through, so for the time being we just ignored the scratches, seeing as they only happened at night and most of us could sleep through it anyway. That, and none of us had actually seen any rats. Another night we were all sleeping peacefully when a loud boom woke us all up suddenly. It sounded like someone had dropped an anvil on our ceiling. It was that loud. We all searched the place, but there were no cracks or broken items or any signs of damage whatsoever, so we just ignored it and went back to bed. After the big boom, we went almost 2 weeks without incident, but during that time the apartment started smelling terrible. At first we just thought it was us. I mean, you had 3 guys living in one place, of course it's a little rank, right? We even spent 1 full day cleaning and washing everything, but the smell kept getting worse. It got to the point where walking into the apartment was like walking into a public restroom where someone had taken a dump and let it sit all day. At this point, we just harassed our landlord with endless phone calls until he came himself. Upon entering our place, he almost puked. Finally, the next day, an exterminator came. The scratches had stopped, but one of my roommates made a video of it with his cell phone to show the guy. He said it sounded like rats, or possibly a possum, but said that usually they don't stink up a place as bad as ours. Now we lived on the top floor of this apartment, and the exterminator wondered if we had access to the attic. We told him no, and that we had never even been up there because the only way to get in was a tiny square door in the ceiling of our hallway that was always locked. The exterminator said he would get access to it from the landlord and return in a few days. Next day I come home from work early, and to my surprise, I see those 2 fucking Russians waiting in their car again. I was really starting to get sick of all the crazy shit going on in the apartment, so I got my courage up and went right up to their window and knocked. They rolled the window down and I asked why they kept watching us. They said they knew I was lying about their friend. I screamed that I didn't know the guy who owed them money and said if they didn't leave us alone, I'd call the cops. In hindsight, I was probably really lucky they didn't shoot me or something, but the driver did give me a stern, pants-shitting glare. Before driving off, he only said 2 things. "I saw you climb up to your apartment. We'll be back for our money." Suffice it to say, I freaked out and told both my roommates. For the next 48 hours, we acted like morons, one of us staying up to watch in shifts at night for safety. Finally, the exterminator came back with a key to the attic. We were all very on edge, so it didn't help when the exterminator looked into the attic for not even a minute before climbing back down and telling us to leave immediately and call the police. We did so, and only when the police came did the exterminator finally say what he'd seen. As you've probably guessed by now, the missing Russian had died in our attic, which was where the smell came from. Apparently, he'd been living there for a while and using some makeshift tunnel in the spaces behind the walls to get in and out without us noticing. We never got the final word on how exactly he died, but I did learn it was slow and painful. The thing that still really ducks with me is why he never cried for help. He knew we were right there under him, but instead of seeking help, he just lay there dying. Obviously, we had all had enough after that and moved out within the next week. Our landlord actually got arrested, but we never really found out what for. The day I was moving all my stuff out, I noticed the police had left the attic door unlocked, and I wanted to go up and see this place for myself during the day. It was very eerie. The space was tiny and cramped. Barely enough room to walk crouched down. You could see the insulation on the walls. The bed was nothing more than a ratty sleeping bag, and the only source of light were a couple flashlights. Wrappers and empty cans of food were just littered everywhere, along with plastic drink bottles. A garbage bag was filled with some dirty clothes, and it looked like the cops had taken or confiscated anything else up there. The most fucked up thing, though, were the little tiny holes drilled in the floor. There were 3 spread out across the space. When I bent down to look, you could see our living room, kitchen, and bathroom pretty clearly. I don't know if the holes were just so he could make sure we were asleep of it. He was just actively watching us. Next to one hole was a clawed-up section of floor with some blood, like he was just scratching with his fingernails nonstop. I feel terrified thinking that he was dying and couldn't speak for some reason, and maybe his scratching was a call for help. I'll never know, but it had really fucked me up to this day. The only paranormal part of this story was the last night I spent there. I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, but on my way back I heard that familiar scratching in the walls. I left immediately, spent the night in a motel, and only came back during the day for my stuff. I've never gone back to that area since.
My own personal experience, take what you want from it. My wife and I have been together for a long time now. I live in Northern Europe, so bear with my grammar. Anyways, there is a custom here to rent a cabin for your holidays, if you can't afford your own one. We are scrolling the internet and happen to stumble into a beautiful log cabin. The asking rent for 2 weeks is quite low for a cabin with these kinds of features, so we immediately jumped on it. We arrived at the cabin on clear, beautiful day. We have been driving there 4 to 5 hours, and we finally reached the cabin. The cabin and its surroundings are divided to 3 different areas. As you arrive in the end of the road, cabin is to your left in the woods. In the front there is a grill and patio area, and up to your right there is a sauna and all that. We looked at each other and thought, boy, what a find. Excited, and all we gathered our packs. Her pack was this heavy, light, bluish luggage bag. I carried them all in the cabin, where we found a letter from the owner wishing us welcome, and few instructions on how to behave and what is expected of you. She ran to search all the rooms, in which there were not many. This is the first uneasy sensation that I get. Kind of, you're not welcome. I guess she felt it too. It caused us to calm down, and all. Well, we looked up for the main bedroom, and found it on the right side of this cabin, so that the bed was right, below this big window, and right behind this window was the untouched forest. Basically, the bed was laid so that I could see straight out of the window. From there, you could see this rock formation, like a small ledge with long grass and plants growing on top of it. It wasn't located more than 3 meters from the window. When I was inside the cabin, I found pencil markings on one of the pillars, the kind to see how much kids have grown over the years. It seemed there were 3 kids. The last markings were from 2004. Their ages were marked right next to the kids' names. I called her to check it out for no reason, and she pointed out that one of the boys' names and height stopped being marked after age 14, while the girls and the younger boys were still marked for 2 more years. And then the marking stopped. She didn't say anything, but we both knew what the other was thinking. I suggested that we go and make something on the grill. She immediately jumped at the idea and said, "Yeah, sure." We went outside and made this great meal. As we cooked, there was this growing sensation of unease about this place, but neither of us talked about it because I thought that she was enjoying this place a lot, and she thought the same about me. So this uneasy feeling was not brought up by either of us. The day was turning to night, and after we had finished grilling, I decided to go warm up the sauna, which was wood-fired, so it took quite a while to heat up, 2 hours to be precise. During these 2 hours, we didn't go to wait or cuddle in the main cabin. Usually we did something like that. The sauna was all ready, and we undressed and went in. I was sitting in the sauna, and somehow, even the sauna's heat was somewhat off. The inside meter said it was plus 90 Celsius. I thought to myself, damn, this is dry. When you are in a sauna, the air can be moist when the heat is pleasant, but if the air is dry, it slightly burns your throat when you inhale. I decided to throw more water on the stones to get more steam that way. She looked at me and started teasing me about the incorrect use of the sauna. Anyways, we bore there for a while, finished our drinks, and decided that it was time to go to sleep. Hand in hand, we walked to the cabin, and that eerie feeling crept up. The feeling was more, run for your life, than, this is awkward. We brushed our teeth, and for some reason, I had to check all of the doors and cabinets. I opened every single cabinet door in the bedroom, and when she asked what the hell I was doing, I lied that I was looking for more pillows. I felt that someone was watching me. Off to bed, goodnight kisses and all that. Somehow, I was not even slightly sleepy. I had brought my daily clothes from the sauna and placed them next to the bed, and on my belt, I had this knife, the same knife we had prepared the food with. I was lying on my back in the bed, eyes open for quite some time, and from the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something. A few seconds after, I thought I saw someone through the window, crouched on the ledge. I could feel my wife's hand reaching for my own. I turned and saw up in the slight light that the moonlight provided that she had not slept a wink. I immediately asked if she was okay, and she said with a troubled voice, "Yeah, could you hug me?" "Sure, come here." And before she moved, I reached for the knife and placed it on the night table. She stopped and said, "You saw it too, didn't you?" I mustered my manliness and said it was probably just a fox or something. She looked at me in disbelief, but she cuddled next to me anyway. I kept staring out the window, grabbed her closer, and she calmed just a bit. Some time went by, and I might have fallen into a shallow sleep. She had shivers, and then those shivers spread to me, shaking me awake. Nothing in the window. Suddenly, we heard a noise from the living room. Someone was walking. I could distinctively hear that as the footsteps moved. It sounded like walking without socks on the living room floor. I grabbed the knife, took it out from its sheath, and placed it in my right hand. She said as quietly as she could, "Thanks." I could hear the footsteps closer now. I signaled her to get up with my eyes and a head movement. I flipped on the lights and turned so that I was behind the door with the knife. The footsteps ended immediately. I yelled from the room, "We are armed, and we are not afraid to use force." I pulled open the door and yelled, "Show yourself with your hands up!" There was no one in the house except me and my wife. I walked from the bedroom to the living room, knife still in hand, grabbed a coal fork, and returned to the bedroom with both. I gave the knife to my wife and said, "Stay close." We both searched the house but found no trace of anyone or anything. After a brief discussion, we decided to get out of the cabin. We gathered our stuff and drove to a hotel. The next day, We went to ask for a refund, since we had only stayed 1 out of 14 days. The landlord, surprisingly, just accepted it, although some persuasion was needed. He said, "Naturally, we need to make sure everything is in order in the cabin." I agreed with him, and we drove to the cabin. Everything was in order. All 3 of us walked into the bedroom, and from the bedroom window, I could see that the grass on the ledge had been severely stomped and flattened. I could see my wife looking at me, and the eerie feeling came creeping back. The landlord interrupted this by saying, "Oh, well, we have had quite a few of these cancellations. But anyways, thanks for your stay." We shook hands and drove home. When we got home, we did some detective work. We searched for the landlord's name, and sure enough, we found it. A 14-year-old kid had drowned, and the landlord was his father. We still discuss this event together.
It was my 18th birthday as any other kid. Just because I turned 18, I thought of myself as a full grown-up man. I have been working part-time during high school, so I had some savings. I started looking for apartments or cheap houses to rent. I found a house, but it was a bit more than I can afford monthly. So I invited 2 friends from high school. We talked a few months ago about moving out and splitting the rent bill. So I called them and they came. The house did have an eerie look to it, so one of them just nope, the other decided to stay. About 8 months passed by, boring and nothing out of the ordinary. One night I started hearing some kind of clapping noise, not loud enough to make me worry. But as the days passed, the sound became a bit louder and more frequent. I tried to tell my friend, but then I thought I would look paranoid and crazy, so I kept it to myself. Until one day he approached me and asked me about it. I told him I've been hearing it. That night, we both slept with a flashlight next to us. We heard it again. We walk out of our rooms. I was so scared to go, so I sent him to go alone. He was scared too. The sound was very loud now. It also sounded as if a child was crying but was trying to not be heard. My friend finally went. It was really a small house, so I kept my eye on him. He pointed the flashlight to where we keep a lot of garbage by the back door. He stood there motionless, and I called him 3 times before he looked back at me. He started walking towards me and went to his room. I followed and asked what happened. He said nothing and to leave him alone. I did, and I went back to my room. For the whole week he seemed troubled. He finally approached me and tells me his aunt is sick, and though it wasn't anything big, he'd rather be with his family. So he left. The noises stopped for about 2 weeks, then it started again. The loud clapping and the child crying but shutting itself up when starting to get a bit loud. I was so scared I almost ran out of the house, but instead I noticed I have balls. So I grabbed my flashlight and went to check. I saw it, but it was moving so fast towards the backyard, I could only notice its basic shape. I didn't even notice the extra 2 legs. This happened around 6 times where it would run away so fast. The last time it was 1 a.m. or so. It happened again. I was expecting it to run away, but this time it just stayed there frozen. I couldn't believe it. I turned off and on the flashlight, but it was just there standing. Not even looking at me, it stood there like a wax figure for about 40 seconds. I don't know, it couldn't have been less because I caught everything about it except his feet, which seemed to vanish in the darkness, but couldn't be more than that, because I couldn't react more than just look. So it suddenly moved, grabbed a piece of stick from our junk area. It was part of a broken broom. It ran out again to the backyard. I followed it this time. It started to dig with the stick. It wasn't really digging as much as just introducing the stick on the same hole over and over. It did it so fast, as if there was something it wanted so bad. It finally looked at me, with its eyes closed but looking at me, and cried so loud. Again, it sounded like a child crying. Dropped my balls. I ran out of my house and stayed there till 7. I went back in, I saw the stick on the floor in the backyard, and this thing had already disappeared. That was my last day in that house. I tried calling my friend, but even to this day I haven't been able to reach him.
Be me in my old apartment. Lived in an upper level of a duplex. Was a huge place built in the 1920s. The apartment below me used to be a general store long ago, and the store owners lived where I did. Nobody was living in the apartment below me at the time, all alone in the building. Late one night, I was on my laptop and heard a loud boom from the corner room. Initially, I assumed that my bike or some other large object fell down there since I mainly used the room for storage. A second later, I hear footsteps from the corner room going into the hallway by the bathroom. Oh shit, .bmp, grab my baseball bat thinking someone broke in. The sound of the footsteps were odd, kind of shuffled or unsteady, as if the person was wasted. A couple seconds later, I hear this shitty sounding moan. It almost sounds like someone with Down syndrome moaning with pain. Freaked the fuck out. Look in the hallway where I heard the footsteps and moaning. I saw nothing. Nervously went into the corner room, turned on the light. Nothing fell down. No evidence of a break-in. Nothing out of place. Still spooked about it, I did not sleep much that night. A couple of weeks later, I went to the landlord to give him my rent money. Asked him if he knew anything weird that might have happened in the building. The landlord said, not really, no crazy murders to my knowledge, if that is what you're asking. But I do know that someone died in your apartment a long time ago, a kid that was kind of slow. Found out that the original owners had a Down syndrome kid that was kept locked up in the corner room. The kid ended up dying in there. Poor dude. SWF. Feel kind of bad. I heard the shuffled footsteps or moaning of the potato ghost 2 more times before I moved out. I had a Down syndrome ghost in my apartment.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.